Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Dr. Tanzeen Doha. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Good to see you, sir. Tanzeen is an anthropologist of Islam and Secularism. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Davis, with a designated emphasis in critical theory. Doha also has graduate degrees in philosophy and humanities. His research explores the relationship between race and religion as categories of modern secularity, specifically looking at questions concerning Blackness and Islam. His ethnographic work examines problems of betrayal, hypocrisy, false worship, disbelief, and other political and moral actions and psycho-existential conditions through an engagement with 20th century Islamist thought. His work can be found in the American Journal of Islam and Society, Political Theology, Journal of World Religions, Antipodes, Reporting Islam, Muslim Women in the New York Times, 1979 to 2011, and Care in a Time of Humanitarianism, Stories of Refuge, Aid, and Repair in the Global South. Doha is the founder and general editor of the journal magazine Milestones, Commentary on the Islamic World. He is also the founder and host of Everything is Fire, a podcast on crisis, catastrophe, and tribulation, sponsored by the Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University. Now, in a peer-reviewed article on anti-islamism in feminism and secular media, you examine how feminism as a political and epistemic project necessarily, you say, requires anti-Islamism, an incompatibility reinforced by media representation. So how did you come to this particular topic on feminism, media representation, secularism, and Islam?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, by the way. And this is a wonderful opportunity to share. I'm glad to go back to this article, which was published in 2018. The article, the research around the article actually came about under Professor Suad Joseph at University of California, Davis. I was researching with several others, various articles in the New York Times that were published over 3 decades, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And during that research, I discovered that there was actually a connection between the representations of Islam that was happening in sort of liberal media and academic trends of feminism, which also had a particular kind of criticism or particular kind of engagement with how they understood Islam or how they conceptualized Islam. So the article basically has 3 operations. On one hand, it looks at a particular kind of periodization from 1979 till 2011. And then it also looks at those 3 decades in which there are these shifts happening in the way New York Times is interpreting Islam and writing about Islam.
Can I just pause you there? The New York Times is not just any old newspaper in America. It's often seen as perhaps the most important newspaper in the United States, and some have even said the most important newspaper in the world, although that I think the London Times might disagree with that, but at least it's the most important newspaper in America. Is that how it's generally perceived?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, I highlight Noam Chomsky's perspective in Manufacturing Consent, where he basically identifies the New York Times as like the mainstream, the main sort of voice of liberalism in terms of media. And so it's really important. I thought it was important to look at that in relation to more sophisticated conversations that were happening in feminist discourse and see if there is a connection in the way that they represent and understand Islam and Islamism in particular. That's another thing. It's not simply about Islam. It became about Islamism. And so I paid particular attention to that as well.
Right. So could you just clarify what you mean when you juxtapose or even contrast? I'm not sure. Islam and Islamism. Are these different ideologies completely, or what is Islamism? I know what Islam is, I think, but what is Islamism?
Well, there is I also kind of refuse the sort of sometimes the differentiation that's done in a simplistic way. Islamism is just basically, if you go with Salman Sayyid and others, and including myself in some of my articulations, I suggest that it's a kind of political project, an ethical political project, and a legal project that emerged in response to the abolition of the caliphate. And so 20th century Islam, when Muslims started to become politicized, a lot of those articulations were considered forms of Islamism. And so there is, of course, the different ways that it was articulated, whether we're talking about the Iranian case or we're talking about the Emirates and the way Islamism was articulated there. And South Asia was a little bit different. And if you're looking at Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb and the Egyptian uprisings and how Islamism was articulated there. So it became a very relevant and important term for the worlds that Muslims inhabited and the political aspirations that Muslims had in antagonism and overlaps with the nation state.
Right. Is this a term that Muslims themselves invented? Or is this something that the Western political observers chose and coined and applied it to politically aware, politically active Muslims in the rest of the world?
That's a good question, but there is a debate on this, and some of the critics have said that it's not a term that is mostly used by Westerners, but I actually find it to be, as an ethnographer, very, very used in the Muslim world. And Islamist now is a very common term of designating a particular kind of project in which Islam is central, and particularly is legal and ethical dimensions.
Okay. So, what do you mean by Islamist periodization, and why is it necessary for this analysis?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So I had to periodize those articles that I looked at in the New York Times, and I found out that generally when political Islam is talked about, it is, and this is the Western problem, it's always talked about as sort of a consequence of larger global struggles, superpower struggles between the Soviets and the US and whatever's happening in the West. So I thought it was important to look at what was happening in the Islamic world from its own perspective. So I looked at 1979, for example, as a very important year in the history of Islamism. There were two events which were really critical. One was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the second was the Meccan siege that happened. So
everyone's heard of the Iranian Revolution. It's even in the news today, of course, because Iran's a constant sort of problem, in inverted commas, for the West and for Israel. But the Meccan siege has kind of been eclipsed by, perhaps deliberately, people were not wanting to mention. Can you just summarize briefly what actually happened in this incredibly momentous event that took place in Saudi Arabia back in '79?
Yeah, the empirical details are in the article, but I would say it was important. There were basically clerics, Utaybi, who basically there was a movement to take over the Kaaba, suggesting that it was under the wrong hands. And I consider it an important moment because of the emergence of an internal critique from within the discourse of Islam at the time. So there was a tension. So the idea that Saudi Arabia or the leadership there is completely homogenous, or the Wahhabis or the Salafis are completely under the control, is incorrect. So there was always a tension. And so without that 1979 moment in the Meccan siege, there wouldn't be many sort of Islamic networks that emerge later in the later decades, showing that there are in fact Wahhabis and Salafis who have been highly critical of the regime and who have been jailed and imprisoned. And this event actually was demonstrating that kind of tension. So this kind of internal criticism, political criticism that Islam had in Mecca and Medina is something that should be taken very seriously. And at the time, it wasn't taken as seriously. And we know in retrospect that it was a very, very important event because in Sunni sort of Islamist and jihadist discourse, that moment was really important and central. So it's a genealogy that we can look at by thinking about the global networks that have emerged in the later decades of Islamism.
And this is before Al-Qaeda, before bin Laden became what he became later on, of course. This
exactly, and it's interesting because I think bin Laden also at the time would have witnessed it, and that this is possible, that there was the possible kind of rebellion happening within the Salafi discourse or Wahhabi discourse and so on, just part of the Sunni Islamist discourse.
Exactly. And then the second period, I think, is it 9/11 onwards to a later date?
The second periodization, I sort of look at the 90s. So
the 90s, that's right.
Yeah, the 90s, in which after the Soviets have been defeated, so we look at a unipolar world in which the US looks at Islam as the main enemy now, not just a problem or something that they could support partially here and there, but rather a major problem to deal with, particularly in Afghanistan and other areas. So it became, so 90s was a more directly interventionist approach. So in media representations, so I should go back to that because there's a connection. In the 80s, much of the media representation looked at, blamed sort of culture. So it separated Islam as culture and religion. Yeah. And this was happening in academic discourse as well. So it looked at the problems that the West didn't like, things about Islam the West did not like. It looked at as cultural practices or cultural problems of this, that, and the other. In the 90s, feminism became much more directly interventionist about Islam, and so was US imperialism. It was much more directly interventionist in its approach. So in the 90s, for example, if you look at some of the feminist articulations about Islam and women's rights and so on, it's very, very clear that they're looking at Islam as the direct enemy at this point within the political field. And then I look at 2001 as the next rupture, which is basically because of 9/11 and how the war on terror began as a particular kind of mechanism. And how that impacted representations of Islam. And there was now an interest, of course, the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, but an interest to find Muslim voices who would try to change Islam internally. So this was where feminism became more interested in finding sort of Muslim feminist interests. And so the war on terror logic was more sophisticated. It wanted to, instead of being so direct in the feminist discourse, it looked at how could Islam have its own sort of feminist articulations. And so the West was more interested in that kind of approach. So this became also clear in the New York Times representations as well.
Yeah, there's some fascinating, I read your article, there's some fascinating examples of feminist discourse within Islam at that time, saying that Islam talks about the equality of men and female, men and women, and kind of ignoring any other verses and hadith or seerah, which tell a different story. So it was kind of, well, I think you at one point said it's rather selective reading of the evidence to suit a particular feminist agenda, of course.
Quranic hermeneutics, for example, Islamic feminism, and the whole point is to basically suggest that the Quran is the main text, of course, and then trying to dismiss the entirety of the hadith scholarship, or for the most part, and kind of diminishing the influence and the significance and the central role of the Sharia, and suggesting, and so saying that basically hadith was produced by patriarchy, and therefore it must be, so that's kind of became a dominant way of looking at Islam from the perspective of hermeneutics and Quranic hermeneutics, of which Islamic feminists participated in very directly.
There's one thing that struck me, I mean, this is just speaking my own opinion as someone who's not qualified, obviously, as you are, that for me, not all forms of patriarchy are bad. I mean, the assumption, the axiomatic, dogmatic, unlooked at, unexamined assumption is that patriarchy per se is a thing that is just evil and bad and cannot be countered. But for me, there are different forms of patriarchy. The Quran has a form of patriarchy, I would argue. Islam does. It's there in Bukhari, Hadith, and so on, without going to all the evidence. Clearly, there are different roles for men and women, usually, and they're not identical. They're different and they're complementary. And, the man is the head of the household, for example, and so on. And so I see this as a good thing because it's the way the Creator has ordained that we as a species should live in harmony together, and so on. But it seems to me that this discourse that you're describing dismisses all that as simply unthinkably wrong. And I'm always struck by how unexamined and how uncritically asserted that assumption is, always, and is never looked at. And I'm thinking, can we look at this, please, critically and question this assumption, please? But it never seems to be done in this discourse. I don't mean in your discourse. I mean in the feminist or secular discourse that you have described so well in your article.
Yeah, and that is one of there's one assumption which is central, which is the assumption of autonomy of the subject, or the radical subject of autonomy, the radically sovereign subject. And the understanding is that when you have an Islamic tradition in which the subject is a servant of God, following divine laws, and is not actually autonomous, is supposed to follow divine laws, to understand divine powers, and is working his life according to a particular sets of principles that he has to be obedient to, then you don't really have the same kind of autonomy or sovereignty. And that is incommensurable with the assumptive logic of secular feminism or secularism more broadly.
Right. There's a great quote here, if I may, read from your article, which I think is a very eloquent summation of what you've just said, and it really gets to the heart of the matter. And you write in the article, which I'll link to in the description below so people can read it for themselves, and you write, this incompatibility between modern feminism and Islamism arises from epistemic, conceptual, and material differences. Modern feminism's basis is the sovereignty of the radical subject, the subject of the Enlightenment, capital E, that's the period in European history, 17th, 18th centuries. It assumes that European women as persons must have access to sovereignty, and therefore that any form of submission to authorities that violate this sovereignty must be addressed as an inhibition for the ultimate freedom and autonomy of women. It is this subject and autonomy that is fundamentally contradictory to Islam's desire for subjects who are obedient to divine will, divine powers, and divine laws, end quote. So you seem to be talking here of a fundamental incompatibility between feminism and Islamic orthodoxy.
Fundamental, at the most elemental level, there is an incompatibility. And yeah, that's my writing right there, which is.
Well, I mean, although I think you're absolutely spot on, and it's really great when I hear people say this, because we need to look at the philosophical, metaphysical substructure of so much of discourse. We don't, in the discourse of feminism and secularism itself, people don't seem to mention this. It's almost like, well, Islam and the West are, we all believe in human rights. There's always the kind of surface alleged connections and compatibilities, but none of this fundamental incompatible paradigms that operate, which you have correctly highlighted. And I find that frustrating because these are incompatible worldviews, I would argue.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well. And my focus though on this paper was less moral and more structural.
Yeah,
I wanted to show that there's a structurally feminism is anti-Islamist. It's not that I'm doing a moral assessment of feminism. I'm not really interested in it. I'm just showing.
But why? Well, so in your article you make this very point you've just said, and I ticked that in that. Oh right, okay. He's not making a moral point; he's making a structural point. Mm-hmm. But why did you choose to do that and not make a moral point?
Because that's a good point. Because I think moral condemnation of feminism is already being done by many thinkers, including popular thinkers, right, without showing a kind of structural genealogy of this incommensurability. which is actually a deeper problem. So there could be many feminists, for example, who could have political articulations that are interesting to anyone, and we could think that there is a compatibility without looking at structural and epistemic incompatibility, which is at the root of the problem. So even if there is, at the level of contingency, various forms of feminist articulations that could be interesting to discuss or think through, because there's a structural incompatibility, it's very difficult to keep a kind of feminist discourse and make it compatible with Islam. And I think the structural point is more forceful in articulating this incommensurability. Because if you're not looking at how ontologically there are different articulations at the level of even how human beings are conceptualized, what is nature, all of those questions are foundational to have an Islamist opinion, perspective, and sets of principles. And without that, if you're only thinking about, okay, such and such feminist said such and such thing, morally or politically, we're not really getting to the main issue, which is the question of incommensurability and incompatibility and antagonism. So I want to go back to your earlier point, right, about anti-Islam and what I would call the de-essentialization of Islam. Islam is de-essentialized in much of Islamic feminist and Quranic hermeneutic notions of feminism, in which the Hadith literature and the Sharia are decentered and made less important intentionally. And this is done in the name of women's rights, etc. And when you do that, you basically de-essentialize Islam. And
what do you mean by that's de-essentialize Islam? What do you mean by that?
Because at the essence, at the center of Islam is the Sharia, to how to have a life that's lawful from the perspective of Islam. And if the Sharia is kind of decentered, then we don't really have any serious Islam left anymore.
Right. So that's a problem, isn't it? In our modern discourse, some modern discourse, in our postmodern world, of course, the whole idea of essentialism or foundational understandings of reality is seen as problematic. We have we don't have anything that's essentially this or that. Everything is about interpretation and perspective and relativity of truth. But you are asserting, contrary to all that, there is actually an essence to Islam, and it's found in the Sharia, I think.
That's correct. I think, I think there is a legal, there's a
modern categories in the name of Islam itself, and saying, no, Islam is a thing. It has a form, it has a structure, it has a content, it has a philosophy, it has a worldview that is there, and it can't just be dismissed as looking at the peripheral cultural manifestations, whatever. So this is quite a refreshing reassertion of essentialism there, I thought.
Yes, and I would say that, if someone is well read in post-structuralism, then they would also actually see the importance of theoretical form. So Islam has a theoretical form. It has flexibility. It has discursive limits. Every discourse has its discursive limits, what it can talk about, what it cannot. So it has all of those things, but because it has a theoretical form, that theoretical form has a legal, ethical, political structure. So it has that. So when one wants to actually decenter at the level of form, then we have a bigger problem than simply moral disagreements. And that's why I'm interested in the structural question. It's not about moral disagreements, and it's not about Islam having multiplicity. Even when Islam has internal multiplicity, it still has a kind of consistency about itself.
It has a normative tradition, doesn't it? It's not like a freewheeling, anyone can call themselves Muslim, has an opinion, that's part of the tradition. No. There's a normative Sunni tradition, for example.
Normative, orthodox, if you want to use that term.
Athari. They recognize boundaries and configurations and forms. So it's not a freewheeling, anarchic, anything goes world.
Exactly, precisely. And I don't think philosophically that's inconsistent with important theorizations by structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers. And I think I'm not necessarily, saying anything that is too out there. It's really suggesting that Islam has its norms, like you're saying, and it has an orthodox structure. And one thing I'm doing in my paper is I'm not doing also, in Islamic studies, unfortunately, there's usually a very clear-cut separation between Islam and Islamism. And I try to not do that, because I think there has been certain projects, just like this project of trying to make feminism and Islam compatible, there has been projects of making political liberalism compatible with Islam. Yes. And there, Islamism becomes the enemy of political liberalism, yes, even at the level of discourse. And I want to actually make sure I take care of that theoretically and show that actually secular liberalism also has this incommensurability. And yes, some of these projects in which Islamist sort of readings or histories are kind of forcibly turned into compatible projects for liberalism, I think are deeply problematic.
Yes, and some recent scholarship has addressed that very point. And although you don't address it in your article, and it's a different subject in a way, but this incompatibility you mentioned between feminism and Islamic orthodoxy can also apply to more recent LGBT, trans, that whole woke ideology, however you want to configure it, and Islamic orthodoxy, but not at the level of well, should this class of people have rights or not rights in American civil society? I don't mean at that level. Yeah. I mean at a fundamental metaphysical level, which you've already articulated quite well, I think, in terms of the Enlightenment individual's autonomous subject and the Islam's call for the submission of the individual to the divine. And you have this same paradigmatic clash again in that discourse as well. So your discussion actually can be replicated in different contexts, I think.
I agree with that. I mean, Mobeen Vaid and others have written on these questions. And yeah, I think we could, when I think about feminism as a discourse, I also think about it as a discourse of intervention in which there has to be, so I'm interested in reading that discourse to understand what the incommensurabilities are. So that would require us to kind of engage. And yes, I mean, all the questions concerning gender, sex, sexuality, etc. There would be concerns about how there is incommensurability between these two discourses, particularly when we have a concept of Islamic orthodoxy, which has a 1400-year-old tradition, which is very hard to kind of selectively read parts that work for the liberal subject and parts that do not work, and to keep that tradition. So if you're interested in understanding that tradition in an actual realistic way, then it would be important to understand its laws and legal restrictions.
I mean, Scott Kugel has done some, he's an American academic, I understand, has tried to reconcile those two in a book, but that's been roundly critiqued by people like Jonathan Brown and Mobeen Vaid. That's quite an obscure area of debate, but nevertheless, this debate has been going on. But even though you discuss the incompatibility between feminism and Islamic orthodoxy, you do discuss in your article, which, as I say, I've linked to below, 3 examples in feminist discourse that you say are important for Muslims to know about. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to explain them in too much of a simplistic way, but I will try my best to kind of articulate it so it's beneficial. So I identify 3 texts, which I say they're exemplar. So I'm not saying that these 3 thinkers and their whole works are important. I don't know. It's what I find is there's 3 essays by them which are really important, and other essays that are like that, are in that domain, in that kind of discourse, would be useful for us to understand actually this incompatibility between feminism and Islamic orthodoxy. So the first text is that I look at, I think is by Sunera Thobani, her article White Wars, which basically shows feminist kind of engagement with the war on terror directly and indirectly. And in that particular text, however, Sunera Thobani does not go with the easy sort of Western feminist discourse. She looks at even sophisticated feminism, which are considered sophisticated and post-structuralist. Let's say by Judith Butler has a particular piece where she kind of identifies notion of the we, in which victims of 9/11 and victims of U.S. aggression in Afghanistan, Iraq are looked at in the same exact way. And Thobani shows how that's not a very good assumption to make, and why. So that kind of article, that kind of writing, where Thobani is actually deconstructing feminism and showing that within feminism, all the way from sort of right-wing feminism, left-wing feminism, post-structuralist feminism, there's an assumptive logic, which is this disarticulation of Islam. And that is very, very important to keep. So I thought that article was very, very important. I like Thobani's work in that way. The second piece that I highlighted as something that Muslims should take seriously is an essay by Hortense Spillers, where she's talking about the history of ungendering that happens through slavery, that was enforced through slavery on African subjects, and how that resulted in a particular kind of rupture in modernity.
This is American slavery, of course.
This is American chattel slavery, and
as Jonathan Brown has pointed out in his book,
that's correct.
We can't generalize from the American experience, terrible though it wasn't typical of other experiences of similar phenomenon.
Yeah. So in Spillers's essay, there is an important kind of emphasis on what happens to these subjects, and I suggest that in order to understand the modern moment, we have to understand the history of anti-Blackness very, very seriously. And Islamism also requires an understanding, because Islamism is often conceptualized as from within the history of anti-colonial struggle and anti-imperialist struggle, but is not as highlighted as a struggle against Western histories of slavery. So much of the slave revolts that happened in the so-called New World were organized by a history of jihad, by the slave rebels, and this is very, very important to keep in mind. So I suggest that those kinds of texts are important to keep.
This is really
those texts are written by those who are interested in the question of gender and how slavery impacted questions of gender and sex in specific ways.
No, what you mentioned is a really important point, because a lot of the, I don't know the numbers, but it was a vast number of Black slaves were actually Muslims, and these were Christian slave owners who purchased or kidnapped Muslims basically and became slaves in America. So it's I mean, this is not a trivial point, but a point not made by you in your paper, which has different concerns. That the idea that Muslims coming to America is a recent thing because of immigration and so on is complete baloney, because Muslims were there even before America became independent from Britain, in vast numbers, living in what became the United States, but as slaves, as Black slaves, owned by Christian masters who often refused to allow their Muslim slaves to practice their faith. So they had to do it in secret. There's a whole story there which really hasn't impacted, as far as I can tell, the Western consciousness to any great degree anyway. Yeah,
I mean, about 1/3 of the slaves were Muslim. And so that's a very important, and many of the rebellions were led by Muslims. There is cultural and historical reasons for that. Even the first recorded slave revolt was by a Muslim. And so there were many incidents of that. And it's very, very important to see how that history plays itself out, and how there is actually a kind of Islamist history, I would say, of retaliation against false worship, because you would have to worship the master instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there was a genuine kind of struggle against plantation owners.
Yeah.
On the basis of Islam. Sorry.
Right. No. I was saying, well, one of the most frequently cited texts until the modern period, de Klerk famously quoted it to Nelson Mandela, was from Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament documents about all authority is instituted by God, and you cannot rebel against authority because it is instituted by God. And this is used to justify apartheid. But there are also numerous passages in the New Testament, not just by Paul, but other letters, which directly instruct slaves to obey their masters. There's even one in a pseudepigraphal letter of Peter, 1 Peter, which says, slaves must obey their masters even when they are cruel. The idea of submission to cruelty and to brutal slavery is actually a New Testament commandment. I say it's pseudepigraphal because it's almost certainly a forged letter, according to biblical scholars anyway. So I don't want to blame the Apostle Peter for that. But these texts were quoted, and I've seen them quoted in Christian slave owners' injunctions to slaves to obey their masters. But of course, Muslims have a different scripture.
Yes, and it's foundationally wrong. So for Africans who came as Muslims, who were Muslims for years and years, were enslaved, and so it's very important to see how that history emerged of struggle. So much of Black political history, in which there is a history of struggle, and some of the most radical ones were influenced by Islam. That's how you get figures like Malcolm X, for example, who emerged as a major figure in the Western Hemisphere for Islam. And I think this has a basis, which for us to understand that, we would have to look at texts by folks like Spillers and to see what had happened at the level of even gender.
Yeah, you mentioned the word struggle, obviously an English word. What's the equivalent in Arabic?
So it would be jihad, yeah. So
that's my point. It's ironic that in America, you could have had a noble tradition of jihad, called jihad, being recognized as a political reality. Today, of course, it's associated with other terrorist events, 9/11 and so on. But it's a shame that it was not recognized as a noble Islamic concept, jihad, indigenous to the United States, or what became the United States, because it was all there. You mentioned a third of the slaves, you mentioned the slave revolt, there was Islamic and so on. So everything could have been, configured in a very positive way, but that's not happened, not yet anyway.
Yeah. And the third text is a text by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak, which I thought was very important because it basically deconstructs ideas of Western notions of modernization, ideas of tradition, and so on. And it kind of does a deconstructive work and looks at the subaltern as someone who, and the idea that subjects are already speaking subjects is a Western assumption. By speaking here, it means speaking a language that's legible within the civil society. So not like can the subaltern speak words, but so can the subaltern speak a language that is legible in sort of civil society discourse, right? So I think that is a very important text because it shows, again, the idea of the history of tradition. So if Islam is a discursive tradition, which, as Tal al-Assad articulates on his founding text, then we have to think about how tradition is interpreted in the West and how it's understood and conceptualized, and often against sort of modernity in specific ways. So something could be done to it in a specific manner. So I think that kind of text is really important to read as well. So again, these are the exemplars. And then in my article, I move towards what I call a categorical analysis of feminism. So I separate generalized view to generalization from categorization. So it's possible to look at feminism as a category and saying that as a category, it has this incommensurability with Islamic orthodoxy. And I don't think there's anything wrong to say that, structurally speaking. If someone wants to morally condemn that, that's a different conversation. And what do I think morally? That's a different. I'm saying structurally, this is an incompatibility. And again, there has been within feminism actually a critique of Western feminism. So constantly, liberal feminists and Marxist feminists always try to suggest that, look, Western feminism is a problem because it does this and that and the other, but there's this other stuff that is important, right? So I suggest that no, the problem is not Western feminism. The problem is that feminism itself as a category has an antagonistic and incompatible relationship with Islam.
Now, you talk about the overlap between these kind of academic feminisms and media representations, and you focus particularly, as we've said, on the New York Times. But does the New York Times just follow kind of the academic trends here, or does it have its own distinctive take on in articulating presumably kind of a more liberal feminist rather than a Marxist feminist kind of discourse against Islam or Islamism?
Yeah, so the New York Times in their representations, as I was saying earlier, is more simplistic than the academic versions, right. But it surprisingly had very similar takes as overall. The conclusions are very similar to how the academic feminist discourse. Of course, there are some shifts. It's not completely exactly what the academic feminists are saying, but the media discourse and feminist discourse have a similar kind of, there's a homology there. And so that's a very interesting for me when I discovered that there is actually a very serious similarity. I did add stuff. So for example, New York Times as liberal feminist discourse would talk about Muslims through the idea of Western notion of rights and so on, ideas of property and so on. But Marxist feminism, for example, is not what New York Times does. So I highlight someone like Federici, who's a really significant figure in Marxist feminism. And even there, I show that she critiques sovereignty of liberalism. But she says, however, the sovereignty that I am interested in, this is what she says, is, and I'm paraphrasing, is the sovereignty that's related to autonomy. So again, both of those are actually ultimately based on notions of autonomy, notions of agency, which emerged out of a particular European history. So to force Islam to inherit that and to make that into a priority, I think is always problematic. And
it's something you didn't explore in your essay for obvious reasons, because it would take you way beyond the subject. But is the genealogy of this subject, this idea of autonomy, which goes back to Kant, goes back to Stuart Mill later on, but and John Locke as well. And maybe others, I'm sure, but these are all very kind of non-theological, non-metaphysical ideas of autonomy. It's kind of quite a secular feel to them, and this seems to be part of just like a fish in water. It's just part of the air, the water we swim in. It's seen as axiomatic and natural and so on. But you're saying, and I think rightly, and others have pointed this out too, it's not at all natural. It's the product of a series of ideological and philosophical movements that have a clear genealogy that we can trace back, that is geographically regional to a particular part of the world, to Europe, and thus to America after that. It's not indigenous to Africa or South America or the Islamic world or China or anything. And yet it assumes, and this is what always amazes me, it assumes a universality about it, as if it's just like laws of physics that are just everywhere. But it's not. It's very particular. But it has this hubris built into it that no, we know best. We Europeans, we Americans, and the whole world must be like us, or you're backward, you're Muslim or Islamist or radical or subversive, dangerous, whatever. And it's this kind of background ideology, which again, this is the deep structure that you allude to.
That's correct, and that's what I suggest. And there's a very long history, the history of autonomy. That's a whole genealogy, like you're saying. And I mean, it's interesting that Federici kind of relies on autonomy and self-determination. So all of these thinking is connected to a history of the state and history of the modern state, and so that's deeply problematic as well, because it's normative Islam is much more flexible about that question of what to do with the state. And I look at Islamism also as a very interesting kind of flexible history of its relationship to the state, and as well as its understanding of anti-state, as understanding of colonialism. So Islamism changes its character depending on historical urgencies and particular situations, right? Islamism in Palestine is going to look very different from Islamism in Afghanistan. It's going to look very different from Islamism in Turkey. So these are things that we have to be very careful about. And I'm an anthropologist, so I pay attention to those kinds of historical.
And that nuance that you brought in your essay is something I really appreciate. I hadn't quite grasped before. That, as you say, what you call Islamism in Palestine, Afghanistan, Turkey, wherever, is different. It's not like the kind of the Western trope of Islamism just happening here, there, and everywhere. No, there are very particular circumstances. Obviously, Palestinians are under military occupation, and the Afghan. I mean, we can go through the different scenarios, but these are very different and often different kind of political philosophies. Kind of.
That's correct. However, it's not up in the air. It's kind of has to follow the discursive tradition of Islam, has to be within that discursive tradition. There is a particular notion of orthodoxy. Those things have to be there for it to be Islamism and for it to be even Islam. So there is no way out of that question. That's why it is concern about incompatibility and incommensurability is so important.
I mean, can I just push back against this term, Islamism? What one could say, and you're not saying this, but what one might say, well, the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, after the Hijrah in Medina, he built a proto-Islamic polity. I'm not going to call it a state because that has connotations of whatever. Polity, governance, rulership, whatever. So he was like the head of state, if I can use that word. There was an army. There was a constitution, the Constitution of Medina, which apparently really happened. So there was a political polity. By the logic of this language of Islamism, one would say that Muhammad was an Islamist. Now, no, you wouldn't say. I mean, we wouldn't use that language, obviously.
I wouldn't.
Of course. I'm not suggesting you would. But why wouldn't one use that language, given the logic of this, which is not my logic? I'm just trying to be descriptive here. Descriptive of the language that's used of Islamism. Why couldn't it also apply to the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, given that he was a very political actor? I mean, he had treaties with people, he engaged in jihad, he did this. He wasn't just a private person who just had prophetic utterances. He was a political actor on the world stage, latterly.
Very good point and very important point. Islamism is a term that I would use for 20th century onwards for various political mobilizations in the aftermath of the abolition of the caliphate, that there was an urgency to the Islamic revival took place. And Islamayun, as a term that came up in Egyptian prisons against Nasser. And the idea was that everybody, particularly in Muslim societies, there are many Muslims and many Muslims are serious. But are they serious enough to make it a political project? And that's what separated them from other Muslims. And so this is actually why I refuse the idea that Islamism is simply an Orientalist term. It's not. It's a term that came up from Muslims themselves to identify the urgency, political and legal and ethical urgency to construct a society against sort of a Nasserite domination of the nation state and so on. And so this is very, very important. And I think a lot of the times, unconsciously, when Muslims find Islamism to be a problematic term, or continuously trying to say that it's just an Orientalist reproduction, they actually have their own anxiety about the term. They have their own anxiety of what it means in the Western sort of discourse, and so they have their own internal questions about it. So, and that anxiety has something to do with, I'm not going to call them directly anti-Islamist. That anxiety is the libidinal economy of anti-Islamism. That is at the level of their desire, at the level of their anxiety, at the level of their affect. There is this a kind of worry or concern, and I think that is also itself the product of anti-Islamist discourse in sort of liberal imagination, even when people are not claiming to be liberal. And I think this is another issue. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, was from an earlier time, much pre-modern era. We're not talking about Islamism there. We're talking about Islamism at the level of what happened under particular kind of colonial history, particular kind of history of the abolition of the Khilafah, and then what happened afterwards. So it's a historical term in that sense. It's not
the way you're using it is not pejorative, it's not negative, it's descriptive.
Exactly.
You clearly defined it as a post-abolition of caliphate political activism, if I can rephrase what you're saying. But, and this is the sting, surely, when it's used in the West, when it's used in France here or in England or America, as far as I can see, at least I could be wrong, very often it's used in a negative sense. It's often synonymous in some discourse with terrorism, actually, with violence, with a very kind of negative understanding of jihad and so on. And so it's not a neutral term. I mean, it might be used neutrally by some academics, but more often than not, I would think it's seen, particularly by Western policymakers, as a problem that needs to be confronted or part of the war on terror, dare I say.
I'll take one step. I'll take a step further and say, not just Westerners,
right?
Secular observers and good Muslims, according to Mamdani, the Muslims that the seculars like. These Muslims and Westerners and the secularists, when they describe Islamism negatively, they're actually describing Islam negatively. They want to call it Islamism so Muslims are not offended, but they're really talking about Islam.
Exactly.
They're talking about Islam, and they're talking about those kinds of Muslim figures who, for whatever reason, and again, this is a structural statement by me. I want to be very, very careful, not a moral one. They're very upset with Islamic resistance in various parts of the world against specific kinds of interventions. And whenever Muslims engage in resistance, they want to use specific terms to kind of delegitimize it to the minds of secular observers, including Muslim. So then Muslims have this anxiety about their own tradition, and they want to separate themselves from the Islamists by saying, oh, no, those are the crazy Islamists. I'm just a Muslim following the Sharia, and I'm just following. But, it's an imperative to think about a particular kind of political governance, not just simply personal practices of Islam. And when you engage in that imperative, in that imagination, you've entered a world of Islamism to an extent, even when you're providing other kinds of conceptualizations of what this kinds of aspiration should look like, and that kind of debate and contestation, of course, is there. But I think this is a very serious kind of anxiety that Muslims themselves have.
Yeah, and the language, I mean, my understanding as a non-scholar of normative Sunni Islam is the obligation to have a caliphate, an imam, a single leader of the Muslims. Now, obviously, we don't have that, but nevertheless, the obligation, it would seem to me, looking at some of the major figures of the Al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah, all of them seem to be ijma on this issue, no matter who they are, really. But that very language today, if I was to express this as a political project today, would be slapped on as Islamist immediately, even though I would be consciously drawing on mainstream normative Sunni Islamic tradition from the great luminaries like Al-Ghazali. Now, Al-Ghazali is he's not seen as problematic by Westerners like Ibn Taymiyyah is, and yet they're both in agreement on this necessity to have a caliph. So it seems as if we're setting ourselves up for an issue here in using this language.
Yeah, and I would say that much of Islamism, not all, as long as something is called Islamism by Muslims themselves, it generally is from within the discursive tradition of Islam. It could try to kind of stretch some of the borders to an extent, and there is a debate around it among scholars, but it's been very difficult to call Islamists, for example, non-Muslim, even by the consensus of the Sunnis. It would be very difficult to do that, I would say, no matter how massive the disagreements are. Okay. And I suggest that Islamists themselves have disagreements among themselves, depending on their orientation.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we have a project called the Umatics Overmere. I forget his Professor Overmere.
Professor, yes. Overmere.
is an American professor, has initiated or organized this project, Ummatics, which is political thought about Islamic governance, not in any kind of sloganistic or Islamist way, to use that word, but in a much more nuanced and sophisticated way. And this language, this discourse is now entering, hopefully, into the mainstream again, but in a quite new and refreshing way, I think.
I agree. I mean, I think those kinds of thinking that's happening in the Muslim world and among Muslims is really important, regardless of agreements and disagreements about specific things within that kind of discourse. I think it's really important to have that kind of space, to have conversations about what an Islamic society should look like, or Islamic system of governance should look like, and how to deal with the question of modernity, because we're living in it, and how to deal with the questions of the secular. And I think that's really significant.
And nation states, because we've bequeathed these statelets or small nation states by our former colonial masters. And, is this how we want to live, divided up into 50 different statelets, or do we want a different conception of the ummatic polity?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. But my last question, really, a couple of questions. How was your article received by the wider academic community? What did people engage with it positively?
For the most part, I think. I published this a long time ago, so thanks for discussing it again. I had to go back to it, and I'll probably write certain things a little bit differently if I were to write it now. But yeah, in 2018, I think it was one of the most read papers I've written, and it's more serious than sort of slogans that we hear against sort of feminism that are too conventional and simplistic. So I think there's been quite a bit of response, particularly from the Muslim world. People have been interested in reading it. In the academy, it was accepted. So I think recently it came out as a chapter in a book that was edited by Saad Joseph. And the reviews are pretty good. So I think overall it was considered pretty serious. I'm sure it is disliked by those who are kind of ideologically not thinking about the limits of feminism and are making assumptions without knowing that they're making assumptions. They, like you were saying, it's kind of naturalizing. If feminism becomes almost like a naturalized phenomena to take certain positions, then you wouldn't like this article at all. But otherwise, I think it's an important kind of conversation starter.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's why I'd recommend people read it, because it gets one thinking outside of the given box that one is told to think about these matters in our Western context. So as I say, I've linked to the article in the academia page in the description below. But it's also a chapter in a book, in a separate publication, as you mentioned. So as we conclude, we'd like to summarize what would be a takeaway from your article for listeners and potential readers of your article, do you think?
I think the main one of the main points, because some of these points are made by many others. I don't think I did like some big intervention. I kind of brought together various forms of readings together. But I think the main idea is to suggest that there is a relationship between the secular and anti-Islam and anti-Islamism, and that anti-Islamism is not simply communal racial hatred. It is actually a libidinal, ontological, epistemic, material structure. And that part of it is, I think, the takeaway. Not to think of Islamophobia in the conventional sense that, I'm going somewhere, someone calls out a name or something, some kind of basic bigotry. Is bigger than that. The anxiety that the secular society feels towards Islam is a very deep anxiety. And in order to trace that, one would have to look at the history or genealogy of anti-Islamism and how secularism actually has within it. The essence of secularism is actually anti-Islam. And that's basically what I would suggest, that actually secularism has this direct confrontation with Islam. and this is hidden somewhere most of the time, but it is the main essence of it.
Yes, and without reigniting the whole discussion again, which wasn't my intention, but I think a difference. Why Islam and not Christianity, not Judaism? Because I would say, this is my personal opinion, is that Christianity, for example, is largely secularized. It accepts the Western liberal secular paradigm as normative for itself, whereas Islam hasn't really submitted to that. It still retains its integrity as a faith, unlike those other Abrahamic religions, which seem to have found a very comfortable niche within the Western paradigm, a secular, liberal, morally autonomous paradigm. Islam hasn't, and so that's why it's seen as a problem. And that's why it's required to submit not to God, but to the Western zeitgeist. And of course, I suspect that the vast majority, 99% of Muslims, are not going to be doing that anytime soon.
Yes, and Islam refuses to be religion in the modern sense, which is something that you practice privately. It wants to be a public discourse. It wants to be the discourse which organizes society. So that is in confrontation with secularity, which wants to organize society as well, and wants to put religion sort of in the closet for the most part. And Gil Anajar, the thinker, says something very interesting. He says that secularism is the name Christianity gives itself when it invents religion. So I think Islam refuses to be religion. Yeah. Islam wants to be a world-making, a historical project in which it wants to articulate that this is the best way to organize not just Muslim societies, the world. And this is the best way to organize humankind. And I think that is not really is compatible with secular interests and the way it imagines the world.
And if any liberal secular viewers find that language alarming, they must, I think, suggest that exactly the same aspirations to global hegemony are also found within liberalism. Because liberalism, with its language of rights and secularity and secular democracy, also aspires to be a global, total end of history. Remember this language of the end of history. It means the complete hegemony of a certain Western liberal secular discourse.
That's correct.
So these are counterpart ideologies, both with global hegemonic aspirations. Fascinating. All right. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Tanzeen, for your time and all the work you put in. And very, very interesting indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much.
Until next time. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.